Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest today is the person most centrally involved in making possible New York's newest delight, to be born again. I'm referring to the Cooper Hewitt Museum, the National Museum of Design, on New York's Fifth Avenue and East 91st Street. And our guest is its remarkable director, Lisa Taylor. Thank you for having us here. I spoke to a cultivated, receptive person the other day, told him that we were coming to visit this museum, and he said, "Tell me, how do you define a museum of design?"
Oh, I thought he was going to say, "Don't ask Lisa what a museum of design is." She says it's everything made by God and man. But we do restrict it here to architecture, city planning.
Excuse me a moment. Go on.
Can you hear me now?
Can you wait for a moment, Babette, please? Fine.
I think I answered the first part. The museum collects architecture, city planning, industrial design, advertising design, interior design, fashion, home furnishings, all of the things that you see here: textiles, wallpaper, furniture, ceramic, glass, metalwork, jewelry, on and on.
Actually, the museum was never really closed. It was just in a state of transition. Can you tell us what the origin and the evolution of the museum is?
The Cooper Hewitt is really the earliest conceived museum in New York. It was conceived by Peter Cooper, who planned to put it in the Cooper Union when he built the Union in 1859. But the expenses in building the school were so great that he could never afford to collect anything, so it took about 30 years more for his granddaughters to take up the cause and to start the collection, and it was officially opened as a museum in 1897.
And what happened to it from 1897 till the 1960s?
Well, it was used almost primarily by students and designers.
And it did not close?
No, it never closed. Don't believe a word you read in the New York Times.
They said some very kind things about this museum.
Well,
we'll believe that.
But they also said we closed 13 years ago, and I think...
Well, what happened in that 13-year period?
Well, in 1963, Cooper Union felt they could no longer afford to keep the museum, and it was going to sell the collection to the Metropolitan and then sell smaller collections to other museums. And a committee was formed to save the museum. And they really didn't know what to do with it because you couldn't give the collection to a private group of people. So the American Association of Museums was asked to do a study, and it was felt this was a very great collection that should be preserved for the nation. And the Smithsonian was approached in the sort of mid-60s.
Why did we have to go to Washington rather than in a New York museum? Wasn't there talk of some association with the Metropolitan at one point?
Yes. Well, it was going to be sold to the Met, but you see, the collections would have been split. And it's very important to keep this collection together because things in one department relate to things in another department. And it would have lost its usefulness. And just as it would have if it had gone to the Smithsonian in Washington. Our Winslow Homers would have gone to the National Collection, the prints and drawings to another collection, and textiles somewhere else.
Is this the first museum that is part of the Smithsonian Institution that is outside of Washington?
Yes, and it's the only private one, too.
And you are the only woman director as well.
Yes. We have a lot of firsts here.
What is the nature of the collection specifically? You mentioned Winslow Homers and architectural drawings. Give us some idea in terms of numbers.
Brag. We have the largest collection of drawings in America, I'm happy to say, the largest collection of wallpapers in the world. Probably one of the finest collections of textiles there is, and picture archive of about 1.5 million, which has grown, or more than doubled, just since we've been here. And we're strong in glass, in other categories. We're probably weakest in furniture because we had so little space on 7th Street.
Well, here we are sitting in a neo-Georgian mansion that has just been recycled as a museum. Perhaps you'd like to describe the building, tell us how you happen to be located here, and I think it's rather interesting that you neither tried to preserve the building intact nor altered it so radically as to lose its good qualities, such as they are. Will you tell us something about the building?
Certainly. I should say it isn't finished yet. You may have noticed that it looks very dirty on the outside, and we're waiting for the wisteria to die, and we're going to start cleaning it sometime, is it November already? This month. And we still have contractors in the basement and on the 3rd and 4th floors. When we finished, it will have cost us twice as much to renovate as it cost to build the building in 1901.
And that was $1.5 million.
That was $1.5 million then.
What would it have cost? Have you ever made any comparison if you were to build a museum from scratch now of this square footage? How does it compare to the cost of recycling this building?
I don't think I should answer. You told me once that you
I was hoping that it was less.
everyone to encourage people to save landmarks, and it might have
Well, then
been
let's
cheaper.
not press that point. Can you tell us anything about the building? I know that it is a Babcock and Willard building, and I know, too, that Hugh Hardy, the architect responsible for the recycling, doesn't think that it really is a great artistic piece, but felt it had merit in being restored. Can you tell us why he believes that?
Well, I think that's obvious when you look at it. It's a very strong building, not a very beautiful building. Its strength is in the engineering, and I'm sorry you can't see the basement. We will open it to the public when it's finished, but it looks like the inside of a steamship. And that's where
Brass
Carnegie's interests were. But the 1st and 2nd floor of this building have basically been restored. Some of the rooms are hidden by the exhibition, but underneath certain fabric coverings, the original room remains. And in the upper floors, we have pretty much opened up areas. They were servants' rooms, and then Columbia University was here for a number of years,
The School of Social
using
Work.
that as office space. And so the upper 2 floors have changed very much, except for the central hallway, which we have on every floor in which we've kept intact.
There are several firsts in the building, too, architecturally. I think it is the elevator. Is it the first passenger elevator in a private dwelling?
In a
city?
private dwelling, yes. And the first air conditioning system.
Well, how was there air conditioning in 1901?
Well, it was filtering air through wet cheesecloth, and somehow it worked. And we were able to save a fortune by using the old ductwork. But most of the expenses in renovating the building were simply to meet modern building codes. We had to add a new fire stair back here and a new elevator, and then to have humidity control for the collections.
Hugh Hardy has said that it is not a true piece of history, but it is a good reflection of the robber baron era. Now the question is this a good solution? Is this building adequate, do you think, for the kind of large-scale exhibitions that you will have to mount here?
We've already outgrown it, and we haven't moved in. But we have another building around the corner, which was going to be our phase 2, year 2000, and it's going to have to start as soon as we finish.
Why don't you
moving in.
explain this plot of land, that here we are sitting in the Carnegie Mansion, and the other thing I think that is so interesting about it is the gardens that extend from the building, and around the corner, the Miller House. Will you tell us the relationship between the Miller House and the Carnegie Mansion and what you plan to use that space for?
Somehow this building was too small for the Carnegies, and when their daughter married, they acquired a house around the corner, and which is where our offices are now, and which will eventually be where our public exhibitions will be housed. Eventually, the entire collection will be in this building.
That's the permanent collection.
Permanent collection, and the other building will house a theater underground. You see, right now, this is our largest space. It's not a very good place to receive company.
We're pleased to be here. You mentioned the permanent collection, which brings to mind the opening exhibition. You said that the show will be a bridge, and I'm quoting you, between the real world people live in and the largely very precious world in our collection. What did you mean by that?
Well, we have much like this in our collection.
What's the date of this wallpaper screen behind us?
1814. It's a very early French one, and the scene is the French in Egypt. It's woodblock.
Well, the name of the exhibition is called Man Transforms.
Yes, and I've been getting a lot of flack about that.
Why?
Well, we've been telling visitors comments, and man transforms. What about women? Perhaps you should do a show called Woman Transforms.
Woman transformed.
And then another, it's outrageous that the word man is used instead of person, people, or whatever. You are very unenlightened. I didn't choose the title, and I was against it.
But you did choose, in fact, in a rather bold stroke, to have as an opening show a show that reflects the fact that man-made design transforms every aspect of human life. And your exhibit aims to demonstrate that. It has generated a great deal of attention and no little amount of controversy, too. So in one way or the other, no one who sees it leaves untouched. I would like you first to describe the show and then to tell us why you didn't take the safe and predictable route of showing from the museum's incomparable collection as an opening show.
Oh, if we had opened with our collection, everyone would have said that nice museum opened with that nice show and nobody would have come back again. No, actually...
But you're very admiring of the collection.
Oh, we love the collection. But you see, it's a collection that the public really never knew. And we wanted to draw on a new and much larger public. We could not show our three-dimensional items, which would have been very popular. Because they're in other museums for safekeeping and also exhibition, and some are in warehouses. And we felt that we couldn't just have 3 floors of drawings or 3 floors of wallpaper.
If Cooper Hewitt used to be referred to, I think, as New York's best kept secret. So I assume that you took as part of your task an attempt to redefine this museum, at least in the mind of the public. How did you arrive at an international show as well?
Oh, I had a choice really of selecting anyone, and the person I selected just happened to live elsewhere.
Do you want to tell us about him and what the show is about?
Well, it's experiential. I shouldn't talk about it. But it shows very, very ordinary things. Breads. Seems perhaps very peculiar to go to a museum and see loaves of bread. But that's part of the design process that everybody is involved in, not just the baker, but the homemaker as well. And we show very old things next to new things. We show very precious things next to very ordinary things, and to show that they're really all a part of the design process. And if you understand certain basic principles that underlie them, you can understand the entire collection. It doesn't really matter what period something is made in or what decoration you use, that there are certain eternal values.
Well, there are some people here who have not yet seen the show, and there are some people listening that have not yet seen the show. Perhaps you would describe some aspects of it. For example, the piece of cloth.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, we have a very great textile collection. And in order to make the public more aware of cloth, Hollein chose to do a room called Metamorphosis of a Piece of Cloth. And he does hundreds of different things to the cloth. You put it on 1 pole, it's a flag. You put it on 2 poles, it's a sail. On 3 poles, it's a tent, and so on. And he's the cloth that becomes the flag, for instance, has a variety of flags that have very different meanings, and that section ends with a film of cloth as a language and someone sending a message by semaphore. And he's trying to suggest that it's more important in the scheme of design than the wheel. It's the first thing we put around us when we're born and the last thing when we die. And to show that, there's a mummy of a crocodile, and clothing and cloth used for 100 different purposes, a bandana, a bandage, everything. And then there's a sculptured hand with the cloth wiping the window to add a little humor.
It's also been described as a learning to see show. How does that relate to the section, for example, on handles?
Oh, I think it's part of every room, really, and I think the one that might be very obvious is the one right to your right, which is a little planetarium based on the theme of star. Now, a star in the sky is just a light beam, and man has translated that into many different forms throughout time and in different cultures. And we've attached meaning to it. You have an entirely different feeling if you see a Mercedes-Benz star or a Star of David or a Sheriff star. And it's been wonderful for the staff as we've been looking for stars. We've been noticing them everywhere. And I even noticed after having these glasses for 6 years that I have stars right here. But in each exhibit there are just hints, and we want the visitor to take it on. And I think if you suddenly look at 200 stars, when you walk out, you'll notice that the manhole cover has a star, and that the hubcap of a car has a star, and you keep adding to it. And the idea was that you would bring something of yourself here and take something away and keep adding to it, and you can do that with any number of forms, and it's lots of fun.
That occurs really in the room with the doors. Perhaps you can explain that too. The concept of the doors.
Oh, there are endless handles and only one, if you have to select the right one to open the door, and I've never been patient enough to do it myself.
It's hard to believe after living through what you have here, which brings us to the question of the funding of this museum. You mentioned earlier that this was the only private museum in the Smithsonian's collection. And I think this is a good time for us to stop so that he can turn over the cassette.
That's the commercial.
Yes, it's your commercial time.
Yes.
Before this museum was opened, more than $6.5 million was raised by Lisa Taylor. How did you do that?
Well, it wasn't easy. It's getting easier, though. You know, it's amazing. I've been getting money from strangers who have read about us in the newspaper saying, thank you for what you've done for New York.
Where did that money come from? Where'd the building come
Anybody
from?
who would give it to me. Most people now run when they see me, as you know.
Where'd the building come from?
The property, which is worth $10 million, was a gift from the Carnegie Corporation. And the money was raised from private individuals, foundations, and corporations to some extent.
When you started raising the money, you really had no building. I assume your task was more difficult then.
No, this property was only leased, and we couldn't raise any money at all, not owning it. And so we went back to the Carnegie Corporation. It was leased to us by the Carnegie Corporation, asking what they could do to help us, thinking that they might give the first 100,000 or $500,000. Hopefully,
Did
they
they?
gave us the whole thing. I mean, the whole property.
You mentioned that the museum was private. Who supports it? Now that you've used up all those millions to open the museum, where does the ongoing support come from?
Well, I should say the Smithsonian Institution, I have to explain that whole background, is really a private institution, but it receives government subsidies from federal government, the way the Metropolitan and the Natural History Museum and the Brooklyn Museum and so on receive money from city government.
Except that is only a part of the local museum's budget, while it is the total.
It isn't.
Well, where
the
else does
total
their
of
money come
Washington.
from?
Oh, they have endowments. And
but pretty close
And
to the
for
total. Because I assume
France,
that one
yeah.
of the questions that is raised, not only with this museum, but other member organizations of the Smithsonian, is the question of privately financed projects that require federal money to maintain them.
Yeah, you see, most of the staff at the Smithsonian is now federally supported. And we had no success, as you can imagine, trying to get any money out of city government at this time. And because we were in New York, it was very difficult to get any money from federal government. And we have just been put in the Smithsonian budget as a line item.
For how much money? This is for next year?
No, it's for it was with the opening, and for 13 guards maintenance men.
But only maintenance and guardianship.
Yes, which amounts to about 8% of our budget.
So that the remaining amount you have to go through your fundraising
we
again?
have to raise.
Well, you've certainly come up with a number of innovative schemes. In addition to running a museum, an ongoing museum, there are at least the beginning of an extensive educational program. Can you tell us about that?
Mm-hmm. We have classes here every night. This semester we have classes for adults and for young children between the ages of 7 and 12, and in January we're going all the way down to 3-year-olds.
What are you going to ask the 3-year-olds to do?
Oh, that's the best age. That's
What will their classes
everybody
be
is
about?
a designer at that age.
What will those classes be directed
Mostly
to?
visual perception.
Well, you've studied art in all matter and form, from calligraphy to drawing yourself, but you're not an art historian. How did you become a museum director?
Well, I told you I was born in a museum. My father was an architect and my mother painted, and I have somehow never known any other world. And
But how did the muse-
I got
but how
all
did
of
the
my art
Smithsonian
history
come
by
to
going
know?
to museums all of my life.
How did the Smithsonian come to know about this process of osmosis that was taking place with you?
Well, I worked at the Cochrane in Washington in the 60s. 60s, yes.
Yes.
And it was really one of the most exciting museums. The Smithsonian was a real sleeper then, and about half the size, and they weren't doing anything in contemporary art at all. And I did the educational programs at the Cochrane and started the first public programs at the Smithsonian, their first classes.
I think you should describe those public programs because they were so significant and are now in the life of the Smithsonian. So you really have to go more than a glossed over phrase.
Well, they have become the model, I think, for museum programs all over the country, and in fact, in other parts of the world. They had 40,000 students, they told me last year.
But those same Smithsonian associates became those same students became the basis of the Smithsonian Associates.
Well, I also started that, but my school was always open to anyone. And
how many
the
Smithsonian Associates are
is
there?
The membership program of the Smithsonian, 1.5 million. But I want to tell you that we sent out a membership brochure about a month ago, and our response was greater than the original response to the Smithsonian Associates 10 years ago.
So how many members do you have here now?
I didn't count after the first week, but there are over 2,000.
And
the initial response to the Smithsonian, and can you imagine now it's 1.5 million, is only 800.
how far do you think the audience for this museum can be expanded?
Well, we're too small to ever think in those terms. But we can plug into the Smithsonian in other ways, and we're very interested in doing educational programs on another level. We have just signed an agreement with the Book of the Month Club to produce a series of home study courses. And we're working on the prototype right now.
And when can we expect to see that?
Next fall.
Let's get back to the question of money, because in the end, it's what will make this museum possible. Who are the trustees of Cooper Hewitt?
Oh, that's my biggest problem with money. My trustees are the regents of the Smithsonian, the Vice President of the United States, the Chief Justice, and they don't make fundraising calls. But I do have a small, several advisory groups. In fact, one basically in every area in which we have collection. We have an architecture one, and Vince Scully at Yale is the chairman of that. an advertising one. Lou Dorfman, who's head of advertising at CBS, is head of that, and we have about 10 or 12.
So you have a wide reservoir of resource persons. But who is your public? To whom do you gear this museum?
We have many different publics. You see, because the collection is so very great, it's of special interest to scholars. It's of special interest to designers, students of design, and now we're trying to make it, just simply popular to everyone. It's the one thing that everybody does, whether he thinks about it or not. We're all designers, and we all make design decisions all day long.
How has the public responded to this show? There's been, I guess, the whole range of agreement and disagreement among the critics, but ultimately it's the public who comes. How have they responded?
We're packed. We don't know how to cope with the onslaught of people. It's very exciting.
What does that mean in terms of attendance?
Well, I think it's about over 10,000 a week. But you see, we're very small. That compares to about 40 a week 6 years ago.
10,000 a week is an extraordinary number.
Well, for a very small museum. I mean, it isn't for the Met, it isn't for the Smithsonian. It has 1.5 million visitors a month.
The Whitney plans on 1,000 a week. I think that we have to reinvestigate that number.
Oh, no, we in 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon had something that has over 3,000. And we've been having groups.
Excuse me, I meant 1,000 a day, not a week.
No, that's very small. 1,000 a day. We have much more than that.
It brings up again a question that is one that is very much on the minds of both the museum directors, but the public at large, and that is the whole question of the numbers in museums. How much pressure is brought to bear on any museum director to produce big numbers?
I think a great deal. It's the first thing anyone asks who's giving you money for an exhibition. How many people do you expect? So it was difficult for us with the first. We didn't want to give our attendance the last year. But no, there are pressures.
And how does that pressure affect what is ultimately shown here? I mean, it's again that age-old argument of box office versus scholarship.
Well, I think you read that no one wants to do any architecture shows in this town, which is why we're doing the Palladio, because it isn't a big crowd drawer.
Well, that Palladio show will be a big crowd drawer. It's, I think, open to the most glowing notices so far. Why don't we talk about some of your future shows? You've made reference to the Palladio. What does that mean, and when will it be here?
In May, and I think you've read about the show recently. They're models of villas by Palladio. Our next show is going to be a very special show in the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. And we have the drawings for the interior of the pavilion. And
do they belong to Cooper Hewitt?
Mm-hmm.
Is any of this show on loan from Brighton?
Oh, well, we will show our own drawings, and we're borrowing 190 objects from Brighton and some special ones from the Queen of England, which Victoria took out of Brighton, and they're now in Buckingham and Windsor Castle.
What kind of objects will you be borrowing, for example?
Those lovely Brighton bamboo chairs that you might have seen there's a great revival of them now. All kinds of decorative objects, dragons and...
What's the major emphasis of your program this year? What do you want us to learn, to absorb from this new presence in our midst?
To be more conscious of design.
And when do we get to see the permanent collection?
Well, we have teasers all over New York. As you know, every museum in the city has participated in a celebration. And they're all showing objects from the collection.
How did that come about?
As someone said, we organized our own tribute. But I felt somehow we couldn't not open with some collection, and we really couldn't show it here, so I wrote to every museum director and said, will you show a few pieces, and they have.
How did you make the move from downtown uptown?
same way. Called every other museum director and said, will you borrow? And the custom, of course, in museums is if you borrow, you pick up at your own expense and you insure and you deliver at your own expense. So we're probably the only museum in history that ever moved for nothing. And then there were certain unborrowables, like office furniture, and we said to Cooper Union, now we know you're renting space outside. What is it worth to you to get us out 3 or 4 years early?
What was it worth to them?
It was worth moving the office furniture. So.
Your work has...
But you see, that's what you have to do when you're poor. You don't know how wonderful it is for us to see people coming in the door and paying to get in. And no, that is rough. The attendance is about, that is correct, it's about, but we don't charge children and we don't charge senior citizens. And we have a number of schools in the neighborhood. Spence's right across, right next door. And we have a whole group of regulars who come every afternoon.
Your work here has not only a national but an international texture. Can you tell us what the relationship of Cooper Hewitt is to other museums in New York, to other museums in this country, and to other museums in the world?
Well, our collection really touches on every collection in New York, and it's totally different. I mean, as the satellite shows will tell, for instance, one would think we didn't have much in common with the Natural History Museum, but our satellite exhibit over there is of rare natural history books in our collection and some Chelsea plates with botanical subjects. We're the only museum in the country devoted completely to historic and contemporary design, so in that sense we're unique. As far as other countries are concerned, we're a combination because we collect both historic and contemporary. Say what in France would be the Musée des Arts Décoratifs plus the new Centre of Design, which is opening at Beaubourg in January. And in London, we would be a combination of both the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Design Council and RIBA and so on.
How do you see your relationship to the very distinguished museum Center for Design at the Museum of Modern Art?
Well, I would hope that we might occasionally do things together.
Well, how do you see your functions different?
You know, we might take a subject and they might handle contemporary and we would do old. Well, it's very different. I think basically the design collection is rather small, about 3,000 objects, mostly of contemporary industrial design. And because they have that, we're not particularly interested in collecting it, and we'll do our collecting of industrial design primarily on film and slide. But we don't really see any overlap at all. And you see, again, we cover 3,000 years. We're very, very interested in contemporary, but it's, you know, it's very small. And we're also interested in many other kinds of design.
Are there regional differences in taste in this country?
I think so.
Is the West Coast more eccentric?
Well, depends how you look at it.
Well, how do you look at it?
I lived in Washington, and we always thought New Yorkers were.
Well, is the Southern Rim more experimental?
The Southerners, no.
The Southern Rim, I mean. Well, let's carry it a bit further. I think it's often one thinks of the West as being more eccentric, the Southern Rim more experimental, and the East more knowing. Would you agree or disagree with any of those premises?
Neither.
There are 3 of them, Lisa.
The South somehow is there too, isn't it? I don't know the South very well and can't judge the South, but as far as...
How would you define the differences in taste in this country?
How would I
on a regional basis?
I think there's, it's not so much the region, but whether you're city folk or country folk has a lot to do with it too. I mean, I don't think there's that much difference. Probably they're a little more flamboyant on the West Coast, but
Do you think there is a greater European influence on the East Coast, other than San Francisco? What city now is responsible for the best design?
what city?
Or state?
Well, a lot of people say Chicago is. I've not been there.
You think because of its tradition in terms of architecture as well?
But obviously it has to be New York. There are more buildings here. There may be more bad ones here, but there are also more good ones here.
And internationally, is there any city that you consider more significant than others in terms of design?
Well, I love Paris, so I'm very prejudiced, and most of the European cities that I find very beautiful are older cities.
And in terms of contemporary design, do you think that Milan, for example, has a particular contribution?
Well, I think as far as the newer things are concerned, we're all building the same thing everywhere.
And no one's
And,
doing it any better or more innovatively than elsewhere?
Not particularly, and I think you can see that in America too. That it's hard to tell these days whether you're driving through Arkansas or Arizona, because all of the chains, whether they're gas station or food chains or motels, are very much the same, and I think international architecture has that too.
Your opening show was put together by 10 international designers. How did you decide, on what basis were they selected?
Well, one was selected and he chose the others. It's hard enough to choose.
So all of the choices were Hans Holein's. Can you tell us some of the architects or designers involved and what they've done?
One is a very interesting Japanese who worked for years for Kenzo Tange, and he's considered really the leading avant-garde architect of Japan. He did a very lovely room.
And his name?
Didn't I mention? Arata Isusaki. I don't think it makes a difference whether I mentioned that. That's so difficult, no one will remember it. He took some of the bird cages in our collection and showed them in his room. And he picked that as a topic because I told him once that people used to refer to us as the Birdcage Museum. And you enter his room through a human cage, human-sized cage with a Fra Angelica angel in it. And then you see all of the cages on pedestals, but they're also caged by a piece of plexiglass, as they have to be in a museum environment. And you see blue skies on the wall, and then little photographs, which are the bird's view from inside the cage. And of course, it doesn't matter what the cage is made out of or when it was made, the view for the bird is the same. And then you look at it very carefully and you see, well, is this really a view from a bird cage or looking out my window from the 12th floor in New York? So, you know, a lot of very subtle meaning. Then we have an Iranian group. Should I go on?
Let's pause for a minute. In 1876, there was an exposition in this country celebrating the centennial of the country. It was especially significant because it was the first time, as you know, that Americans saw that functional design could be aesthetically pleasing as well, and in many ways revolutionized the environment in which we lived. Do you see any such almost revolutionary effect occurring in the most recent period? I'm not specifically referring to the bicentennial, but any other catalytic event that has changed the way we look at design and objects, our environment?
I think it's changed a lot. When we first acquired this building, I could never bring an architect up here. I mean, we'd always have to meet in his office or in my house.
Why?
And they said, you can never make a museum out of that building. And somehow the attitude has changed so much, and recycling is in, and we're right on target. And also, it's very funny because probably the most avant-garde kind of art you can have these days are things like this. So we're right on target when we start pulling them out.
Why do you refer to that 18th century embroidery as avant-garde art?
Well, I think it is. I mean, even our modern art museums are showing 19th century art. So we have a lot. We have about 3,000 years to back it up.
Well, you've said often that design is everywhere. What do you envision design to be in the 21st century?
Even more streamlined. Probably be able to throw everything away.
Can you be specific
Instantly.
about any specific object or environment or dwelling or technological advancement that you are aware of? That,
I don't think I want to live then.
well, you are a long-range planner. What do you think design will be like in 5 or 10 years from now? Will there be any dramatic changes?
I think there is a difference, and it's funny, we, for years, design or so-called good design has been stripped of all decoration. And I think there's going to be a revival.
To surface ornamentation?
Mm-hmm. And just to pattern generally. You know, for years you could only buy a solid colored dress or stripes or something. And we're back to flowers and birds and all kinds of things. And so I think that's coming back.
In the surface ornamentation, which of course will reflect itself in buildings as well as paintings, what portends this new direction?
Well,
What leads you to believe that?
Oh, I think things go in cycles, and nothing really in design is ever new. You know, that we just keep going on and...
And what cycle are we in now?
In a depressing cycle, and it's changing. No, I'm very glad that we have a very great collection to show, to draw on, because a lot is rather uninteresting. But I think there's also, for the first time, a public concern about design and a concern on the part of the designer about other things such as appropriateness. And you see, not just judging a building in its own right, but judging a building in relation to its surrounding buildings. And for instance, that's why it was so important for us to preserve this house, because it preserves a whole community that's named after this house. And we had a number of offers from
the
developers.
Carnegie Hill community
Yes.
is the name of the historic district that this house is contained within.
But we had quite a few offers from developers to build condominiums here and to give us the first 5 floors or to build in the garden. And my, it was tempting.
Do you have any innovative air rights or border schemes of your
Well,
own?
we do. We have very valuable air rights if anyone were building, but no one's building these days.
You've said for the years that you were trying to put this museum together that you'd hoped that it would change the way people would look at things. Do you think you've succeeded in that aspiration?
But we're only open a month. Just come back and ask me in a year from now. I think that we will have some effect.
How has it changed your perception, your way of looking at things?
Oh, I told you, I'm seeing stars everywhere.
No, but other than this one show, other than the show that you're obviously very caught up with at the moment, you've lived through this now for more than 6 years. And I assume that you have refined and defined and redefined your own perception, your own value structure, as a result of being so immersed in this subject. In what ways has it changed your way of looking at things, your way of life?
I've been too exhausted, actually, in recent weeks. I'm just so happy we made it. But I think our thinking changes and is refined all along.
How would you describe your own design philosophy?
Well, I'm very flexible. What we don't want to do is say this museum believes this and we think this is good, therefore if you don't think this is good, you don't have any taste. We want to show many different styles.
How do you define
to
quality?
have this place be a forum, really.
Well, then how would you define quality or a standard within that resilient, flexible framework?
Well, there's still a great range with quality of what? I think as far as quality, a safety pin has quality. Wonderful design. The test is that nobody's trying to design safety pins anymore. We have the ultimate, and it's good looking and it works, and you can't say that has quality if you compare it with a Porsche or something, you can't make broad statements like that, I think, that are valid as far as design is concerned.
If you had it to do over again, what would you have done otherwise in terms of the museum and the show or any of your plans?
I would have left immediately 5 years ago. Then it was too late. Then it was a question of pride. I had to do it, and there were so many people depending on me.
Did you ever expect your life to unfold the way it did?
No, did you yours?
No.
No, well, mostly in my day, little girls didn't dream about growing up and being museum directors. And my daughter doesn't want to be. She thinks it's too hard.
But she's been a first-rate curator of this museum ever since it's opened. She's taken visitors around and demonstrated all kinds of things. Tell us about some of the shows that you have planned and some of the ancillary programs for the museum.
We have developed one series of exhibitions called Immovable Objects. And we did the first experimental one about 1.5 years ago on a shoestring. And that was to have people look at architecture in its natural surroundings, not in a museum through drawings, which very few people understand, or through models which are the wrong scale and really don't give the feeling of it. And we put Lower Manhattan on exhibit. And we actually put labels on buildings, and then had a number of exhibitions within the exhibit. One was on the building of a skyscraper, which was held in the lobby of the Woolworth building, and then 2 other exhibits analyzed 2 blocks, why one had changed so drastically and why one had remained the same. And it was a lot of fun. Difficult to get started because we would call certain people and say, would you clean your building? We'd like to put it on exhibit. And they thought we were mad. But it was a very successful show in the sense that many, many people who would never come to a museum saw it. And it's being copied in cities all over the world. And we would like to do a whole series of those. We're in the process of working on one on subways, analyzing.
What will you do with subways?
Well, you see, what we want to do is change the public attitudes towards subways. I mean, they don't have to look as awful as they do, and we're the ones who make them look that awful. So what we wanted to do was to analyze 12 systems, Moscow, Paris, Toronto, Mexico City, and so on. And
it's a far cry from an adopt a subway idea.
That will be in subway stations in New York, and we will publish a newspaper instead of a catalog, as we did with the other one, because you see, you reach a much wider audience. And actually, we may be doing something with the subway station too.
For example?
Possibly redesigning one. And then in that vein, we're doing one on parks, playgrounds, and plazas. And what we would like to do is leave something behind and leave a new park behind. And then one will be on the concept of Main Street, and Broadway is New York's Main Street. And exhibits all along, in storefronts all along Broadway. And then the whole show in Albany, where Broadway ends.
We've talked to a number of museum directors now, and more they tell us that in order to survive, they have to beg, as you have, borrow, trade. How much of their time is spent in what are generally considered non-museum director activities? In terms of the future direction of museums, do you think that a museum director should be an art historian or an administrator?
Probably an administrator. You couldn't run a museum and do your own research. I mean, I'm sure that's true of every museum director in this town, or any large museum.
They've also talked about the future direction of museums themselves. Some obviously all see the function of museums to conserve and preserve. Yet, what do you think the future role of a museum will be?
I think more of an educational role than it's been.
And in terms of your museum, how will that manifest itself?
Well, I did mention briefly the home study courses we were planning to do. We would also like to do programs on television, cassettes. We're already producing slide kits. While we've been closed, we've been photographing everything that we've had on the premises. And we have made over 40,000 slides.
So that is available?
Mm-hmm. At cost to all
Actually,
schools.
there are a number of professions that use one section of this museum as a fundamental resource.
Mm-hmm.
Architects and designers, isn't that so?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of designers of fabric, of wallpaper. And we're getting involved in some of that also, just to keep alive.
Is this merchandising your museum?
Well, you see, what happened is people always used to use our collections and change them slightly.
What are you going to
entering an
franchise
arrangement with them, we have the opportunity to supervise and to see that it's well done, and we get a 5% royalty.
In terms of going in that direction, are you planning on packaging and marketing any of your things yourself? For example, the way the Metropolitan does?
Well, on a much, much smaller scale. We don't have the money to invest in it, but we are already starting a collectors club.
And what does that
mean?
Members,
to reproduce or commission new works in limited edition.
Have you started to commission any yet?
No, but we're narrowing down some first choices.
Is this ceramic, silver?
Anything. Mm-hmm. You're just thinking of some of the things we might reproduce.
Well, I keep on picturing Mondrian bed sheets at the Museum of Modern Art, so I cannot imagine what you're going to be doing
No,
here.
but listen, I should tell you, they're wonderful. The sheets by contemporary designers are wonderful things to collect. I buy them and put them in my daughter's hope chest. And you see it when she gets married in 20 years from now, she'll be the only one with a Cecil Beaton sheet or Bill Glass.
And the only one with a non-throwaway sheet, in terms of what you said earlier, too. One of the questions we've been asking each of our guests is a less than fair one, but it has not stopped me from asking it. And that is, regardless of price or availability, what object would you like to be surrounded by, to have for yourself or for this museum?
What one object?
You don't have to limit yourself to one. We know what a great collector you are.
No, we're interested in process, not just in objects, so that's an unfair question to ask me. Now, one of the things this museum wants very much to do, which will be reflected in its exhibitions, is to study the whole process of design, or how things look the way they do, why they function, and not just emphasize only the end product.
What is your favorite period?
Well, probably 18th century.
And is it furniture? Is it porcelain? Is it embroidery?
Well, I'm a collector of anything that's smaller than a bread box.
And what do you include in that collection?
Oh, well, I like things that are containers, basically, boxes or perfume bottles or just bibelots, but also antique picture frames, combs, just small things. And that's because I do think your environment is very important, and when I married my husband and moved to New York, he was already established in an apartment, and I felt very uncomfortable there, not having any of my own furniture around me. And then I started to bring up my little things, and there are more of my little things than there are of his big things, and it's very much my apartment.
What is the central focus of that collection? Is it the 18th century?
It's really anything I like. You know, and some are very fine, and others are simply little paper boxes, and some are new, and some are very old. So it,
One of the topics that have been speculated upon for the last several weeks, and is obviously a topic for speculation and concern and interest for each of us, is the fact that a new administration, political administration, will occur in a very short while. What do you think a democratic administration means for the arts?
oh, I think it will be very much the same. I think it would be a bad policy not to support the arts. And I think each year the federal allocations will increase, and it won't matter what administration.
You're saying that the one thing that now is beyond partisan dispute is the arts. And so that I assume what else you're saying is that suddenly there is a constituency out there that makes themselves known to whomever is the office holder.
Yes.
What leads you to that conclusion, Lisa?
Well, it's, no, it is a popular thing. There is a problem, though, for the National Endowment, which has to distribute money nationally, and I served on the museum panel for 3 years, and know is that most of the requests come from New York and from California and Boston, and just really about 4 or 5 states.
Isn't
And
that
we're
a
supposed
central
to-
question that will have to be faced? Do we decentralize this money, or do we send it to the primary, so to speak, institutions?
Well, you see, they've tried to do that in the part of the National Endowment budget goes to state arts councils to begin with. So in that sense, it does get out across the country. But then other things really are, we liked in our panel to judge things by quality, but always keeping in mind, you know, that we can't give it all
Geographical
away
range.
in New York. But if you did do that, I think the arts would suffer.
Is there consideration given to the fact that major urban centers often have the largest museums, but ultimately share what they have by circulating those exhibitions throughout the country?
Yes, and a lot is done by the endowment to encourage working together. They're setting up regional conservation centers all over.
Are you planning to set up regional centers of this museum?
We're setting up conservation centers, but our collection is so large and in such bad repair that it'll be about 10 years before we'll be able to take in other work. But then what we would like to do, as soon as we have set them up, is to take apprentices.
Well, special thanks for taking us in tonight. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, talking with Lisa Taylor at New York's Cooper Hewitt Museum, the National Museum of Design. Thank you very much for having us.
I hope you all
Or the Signs and Symbols show, which was put together by Venturi, or any of the other friends there?
Well, we certainly can. I mean, we have no specific plans to take either of those shows.
Please, there is one person talking at a time, and right now it is Mrs. Taylor. Excuse me, please.
The Centennial show is too large, and we have a special opening year festival, and by the time, well, actually also the Venturi show wouldn't work very well in this building. I did go down and see it. And
The one at the Renwick. Sir.
But, you know, we lend back and forth very freely, and we have sent many of our collections down there. For instance, we had a large costume collection, and we didn't want to compete with the Costume Institute 6 blocks away, so, you know, we sent them there on loan.
How much money does the museum have for acquisitions, and how are new acquisitions obtained?
Well, we have an acquisition fund of about $250,000. which I had to freeze until I was sure that we would have a museum, and so we've just started to unfreeze it. And
Have you
of
made
course-
any purchases since you've opened?
No, we've all been too busy. But we have been offered so much. Just since we've been up here, we have been offered, or not have been offered, because we turned down most things were offered, but we have accepted over 71,000 objects.
Since when?
Well, since in about 4 years. But you see, I mean, an object can be a small plate.
How does one count table service? Is it by the object or one unit?
No, we count it as one. That's why we have no way of really estimating the size of our collection. Because a set of silver would be acquisitioned as one
You
number.
had said that you felt that someone who's experienced in administration usually would work as a director. Do you have an art history background, or have you always...
Well, no, I've studied history, and then what I was really more interested in was using my hands. And then went on I studied Chinese history because I studied Chinese language, and all kinds of things that are totally unrelated to the job of a museum director.
Well, you were a ceramicist, and that relates to your job here. Are there other questions?
Are there slide kits available to public schools?
Are there?
Slide kits available to teachers?
Are there slide
Yes.
kits available
We
to
have
public
to-
schools or teachers, was
Well,
the
you see,
question.
what we are doing is we're just starting to reproduce the first ones, and I think we've made about 8 of them.
Is there someone who hasn't asked a question yet? Someone in the back the gentleman in the back, Lawrence.
At various times in the history of design, one medium or another seems to be a predominant medium, and in other mediums you will notice that there's a lot of derivative work. Do you see today any one medium or one particular medium that is influencing another one as you look at the world of design?
Well, I think synthetics in general. You know, everything is changing. It's very hard even to buy cotton sheets or linen sheets. They're completely impossible, or curtains. Just certain things are disappearing because as the other things are more practical.
Perhaps I used the wrong term. I'm thinking more of the fact that
Whether you mean wood or...
well, yeah. Sometimes we'll notice that architecture seems to have a very great effect upon small jewelry that's made. Or at another time in history, you might find that jewelry work is being moved into some other medium. I'm thinking of the way tapestries at various times reflected painting.
Well, I think we're going through a very funny period right now, which started with the energy crisis. So all of the L values went down the drain because contemporary design basically was based on maximum use of energy. And so we've had to reevaluate. And it's why everyone is confused, and it's why, for instance, you would find a Beaux-Arts show at MoMA, which would have been unheard of, 5 years ago, because...
So you're saying we are in a period of reevaluation, and that obviously is why that show occurred too. There was another question.
I had a question about the announcement today of the Education and Communication Center that's being set up at the Metropolitan. What effect do you see this having on...
I think that's going to be wonderful. We should have more. The Smithsonian is doing a similar thing.
Who's paying for it with the Smithsonian?
Private, so...
Has that been announced yet? And what do they plan to do?
Well, to produce...
From their
series.
archives,
they have
incredible. But that won't relate only to art history, it'll be the
No,
whole
you see,
range.
art would be very minor as far as the Smithsonian is concerned. It would be history, technology, air and space, natural history.
But that really may be the advent of this promised wired revolution that we've been hearing about for 10 or 12 years, when that kind of money gets behind institutions that are museums, but akin to university centers in terms of just the reservoir of data and materials and objects. It's quite extraordinary what it portends and how that can be disseminated.
But you see, we will all benefit from that. The more people are interested in art, the more they would go to any museum.
And the more you here on a smaller scale will get money as well.
There'll be a much greater demand.
The
So
person,
I couldn't be more pleased.
yes.
What, speaking on that subject, there are more people who are obviously white, middle class, who are interested in it. What attempts is your museum making to bring in minority views, certainly minority views on design and like African textiles?
Well, we have had no control over who comes, and we haven't, we were surprised that so many people have been coming, so we haven't been out looking for people.
But you will plan an outreach program.
Yes, and in fact, we are doing a show, again as part of the Immovable Object series, on ethnic communities and their contributions to design. Some have been very small, and others have been quite major.
Which ethnic community has had a significant...
Well, I mean, just, we're not measuring whether this one has contributed more than that one, but to try to document the various contributions.
The gentleman in
And
York.
also we will be offering scholarships.
I was fascinated by your downtown architectural show, your immovable objects show. Are you planning to have more of them? And how do you see the role of the museum as an exponent of, as a museum of architecture?
But
Both modern as well as...
we are planning to do a whole series, and we learned a lot from doing that. First of all of our labels were stolen. And what people would take them as souvenirs, or very often the owner of the building would say, yes, of course, we're delighted to have you put our building on exhibit, and then he wouldn't tell the cleaning man, who would think we had defaced his building and ripped it off. And but also very large banners. A 9-foot banner disappeared during the night. And so that during the past year, I've had people working on how we might do this and have it survive vandalism, which is the biggest problem, really. But no, we have a whole series, and they will be done as quickly as they're funded.
Is there a last question from someone who hasn't asked one? Are there any further questions?
What kind of wood is this?
Oak.
Actually, this is one of the outstanding architectural details, isn't it? This oak coffered ceiling.
And it was oak of the period. It was not old oak.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your evening classes? You mentioned adults and children and so forth, but perhaps a little bit more description.
We have 5 semesters a year. A fall, a winter one which begins in January, spring one in April through June, and then 2 summer sessions. And we have we will have at least 10 or 12 courses each semester. At the moment, we have one on Art Nouveau, on the English Country House, American Decorative Arts. What else? Oh, silver, theater design, costume.
Actually, there is a way for you to receive that information, because obviously the museum not only wants you to come, but to come often. To whom do they write or call for
I
that?
think there may be a few.
I noticed there were
back
things
there.
on the table in the rear right. If not, I think if you call the museum, there is a department that really deals with that in great detail, and I know they're eager to have you.
Or the address is 90th, so a postcard will do.
Thank you again, Lisa Taylor, for having us. Thank you for coming. See you next week for last.